That time of year again, the only time I ever come back here. My name is Megan Doyle, and I live in Watertown, New York. But before that, I was born and raised right here in West Virginia. I grew up in a small house with my mother and father and lived a relatively normal life. My parents weren't bad people, but they knew nothing when it came to raising a child. They just did not seem to understand the love and attention a child needs in order to grow healthy and happy. For the first 10 years of my life, I was pretty much alone. I had no family other than my mother and father, and no friends except for my dolls, some of the animals in the forest, and those which I made up in my own head. I love my parents, and I do believe they love me, although they did not show it much, especially my father. He kept mostly to himself and seemed to want to have nothing to do with me. He never played with me, read to me, or even talked to me much. Mother often tried to spend time with me when she could, but was always busy with housework, and like my father, did not really appear to have an interest in me. So yes, the first 10 years of my life were a very lonely time. And then I met Genghis. One morning, as I was picking wildflowers down by the riverbed, I had attempted to cross the river using some stones. I knew they were slippery, but thought I could make it across. I was wrong and slipped, slamming onto the hard, wet rocks. I struggled to get up, but with the pain in my arm and the strong current pushing me down, it seemed almost impossible. I tried to hold onto the rocks the best I could, but the current began pushing me away from them. I could feel my fingers slipping away and screamed out in terror. "Help!" I screamed. "Somebody please help me!" I began to sob uncontrollably, and it was then that I heard a dog barking. I looked up and saw the dog splashing through the river towards me. My eyes lit up at seeing him. He was like some guardian angel who had heard my peril and had come to my aid. I wrapped my arms around him and he dragged me out of the river and onto the grass. I hugged him and he began licking my face. I asked where he had come from, but he just looked at me with that strange stare dogs sometimes give when it seems they are trying their best to understand. I walked home with the dog as quickly as I could and told my parents what had happened. My mother bandaged my arm and my father scolded me for going into the river, but did not say much about it afterwards. That night, I fed the dog and gave him a kiss. "Thank you," I said. "Now please go home. I'm sure your family misses you." The next day I woke up fully expecting the dog to have gone, but he hadn't. There he was outside as if waiting for me. At seeing me, he wagged his tail and stood up, treating me to a little spin. I laughed and clapped my hands. The next few mornings I was sure I would find that the dog had decided to leave me and go back home. My heart always sank at the thought. But there he was every morning waiting for me, ecstatic to see me. I decided to keep him as my own, at least until his owner came looking for him. How I hoped that day would never come, and it never did. Soon I allowed him to sleep in my bed at night and named him Genghis Khan after a character I had read about last year in school. I now had a friend, a very good friend. Every day that summer, Genghis and I would play outside. We ran through the fields, we caught fish in the river, played ball, and sometimes I would even ride him home at the end of the day. He was always there for me, companion, protector, friend. For the first time, I felt like there was someone who truly loved me. With my parents, it was different. They loved their daughter, but Genghis loved me. I'm not sure if I can explain it any better than that. I loved him too. I loved him very much, and not just because he was my dog. After that summer, school began and I would walk home every day with my books. Sometimes Genghis would show up to walk me home, and sometimes he wouldn't. This particular day, I did not see Genghis waiting for me, so I began walking home alone. As I approached a small path which led into the woods, I noticed a strange, dirty-looking man standing at the foot of the path. As I crossed his path, the man approached me. The first thing I noticed were his big, hideous teeth. The second thing I noticed was the foul odor which emanated off him. He looked me over with dark, tired eyes and laughed. "Where are you going, child?" he asked. I stood still, very still, and afraid, but managed to get out the words. "I'm going home, sir." The man grinned and took a closer step towards me. "Want to come home with me?" he said. I can't," I said. "I told my parents I would come straight home from school." "It's been all right," he said. "Your parents, they told me it's okay. I've been waiting, girl." For a split second, my muscles unfroze, and I began to run past the man, but he grabbed my hair and then held my arm. I screamed and dropped my books, trying desperately to break his grip, but the man was very strong and would not let go. As I struggled, he began digging his dirty fingernails into my skin. I tried to scream, but he held his hand over my mouth. He then lifted me up and put me over his shoulder. "Scream and I killed ya," he told me, and I began to cry. He then tried to walk back down the path into the woods, but for some reason he stopped. It was then that I saw why. Genghis was standing there blocking his path. I could see him showing his teeth and growling at the man. "Out of the way, you stupid mutt," the man shouted and kicked dirt at Genghis. But Genghis stood his ground and his growling began to intensify and grow more menacing. I had never heard Genghis growl before. I could not see the man's face, but I could tell that he was afraid. "Is this your dog?" the man asked. "Tell him to step aside or I shall kill him." I began to cry and struggled to get away from the man, and as I did, the growling became louder and fiercer, and Genghis looked as though he was going to spring at any second. At that moment, the man threw me to the ground, hurting my head and back. Then he pulled out a large hunting knife and stood waiting for Genghis to attack. I just sat on the ground crying hysterically. I was sure the man was going to hurt Genghis, kill him even, and then probably kill me as well. But I could see that Genghis was not afraid, and even though he held a knife, I could see fear in the man's eyes. I cannot remember if the man made a movement towards Genghis or not, but I do remember that in a sudden flash, Genghis was on top of the man, biting his arm and growling like a mad dog. The man shouted and screeched, punching Genghis in the face with his free hand. I could tell by his screams that the man was truly afraid. He shouted and begged at me to please call off my dog. I did not know what to do. "Please!" the man shouted to me. "Please call him off!" Genghis's actions were so savage that they actually frightened me as well. I got to my feet and yelled for him to lay off the man, and he released his bite and stepped away. When the man stood up, he was covered in blood. The flesh on his arm had been torn away, and I thought I could see bones sticking out. He screamed and hollered and cried out, "Please! Please keep them away from me!" Then he ran back into the woods where he came from. Genghis continued to bark and growl at the man until he was out of sight. I got to my feet and hugged him. This was the second time he had saved my life. I decided not to tell my parents what had happened in fear that they would make me get rid of Genghis, fearing he was dangerous. But I knew that his violent acts had come from his love for me. I felt nothing against him for what he did. What he had done for me, to protect me. And today I am grateful that I never did tell my parents about the incident, for little did I know I would need Genghis more than ever in the dark days which were soon to fall upon us all. It had been just under a year since my encounter with the gruesome man on my way home from school. My father was reading the newspaper when he came upon an article about an extremely ghastly murder which had taken place in our community. The victim had been old Mr. Jenkins, who lived alone in his cabin near Bixby Cemetery. "I remember doing work for that deadbeat," I remember my father saying. "I had to repair his corn stripper one summer. It took him 3 months to pay me for the job. He was a loafer, but this was more than he deserved. It looks like wolves to me," my father said. "No human being would have done that to another." "But George," my mother had said, "the police say that whomever killed him climbed in through a window." I did not know exactly what had happened to Mr. Jenkins at the time, but when school began, I had learned that his body had been skinned and dismembered. Also, there were rumors that whoever did it had eaten most of him. Needless to say, I was horrified and always checked my window at night to make sure it was locked. It wasn't long before another victim appeared in the paper. This time it was Mrs. Towns and her son Ralph. I remember meeting them one time at one of the church picnics. They were nice people, although Ralph seemed a bit soft in the skull, so to speak. Once again, the papers did not go into detail about the killings, but rumors spread. It was said that the Towns had been murdered in the same way as Mr. Jenkins, only this time Ralph Towns's remains were found a few miles away, at the bottom of the Richmond's well. Now people were very frightened. Everyone made sure their children were home early and that all their windows and doors were fastened shut. By this point, my father ceased believing that it was due to wolves. A while passed since the Towns' murder, and after a while, the people in town began to feel more comfortable. Maybe it was just a freak animal attack after all, they thought. Right around the time of the murders, lots of livestock were being found the same way, and that was still going on. I began to have similar feelings, but still refused to go to sleep at night without checking my window. Even if it were some beast, I thought, that idea didn't exactly give me much more comfort. I would soon find, however, that my efforts were for naught, as the Hobyahs had figured out how to open locked windows. It was early October when they came. I was laying in my bed fast asleep when I felt a cold chill, which woke me. I opened my eyes and noticed that my window was wide open and letting in a cold draft. I reached up and closed it, but could not seem to get it locked. At first I could not understand why, but it soon dawned on me. The lock was gone. It was then that I heard little footsteps prancing about the floor. I sat up in bed and thought I heard a tiny little voice giggling. Before I could even rationalize this in my head, I felt the draft again. I turned towards the window, and what I saw there still haunts me to this day. It was a little creature, green-skinned with pale white eyes, sharp claws, and a long, skinny tail. I was just about to scream when I felt a tug on my hair which pulled me back against the bed. Holding my head down was another creature. The first one I had seen now jumped from the windowsill and was standing on my bed. He stared into my face and grinned at me with an evil, ugly stare. I tried to scream now, but couldn't. The creature on my head had dropped some kind of strange powder over my face which seemed to block out my voice to just a small whisper. I knew my parents would never hear me, and tears began falling down my face. Someone, however, did hear me. Before I saw him, I could see the concerned looks on the faces of the little creature, and I knew Genghis was there. The creatures released their grip on me and made their way over to Genghis. They snarled and hissed at him, but I could tell they were afraid. Genghis, I knew, was not. As one of the creatures swatted at him with its long, sharp claws, Genghis let out a savage bark and lunged at them. Both of them screamed and jumped away. Genghis was fast, but the creatures were faster. Up into the windowsill they jumped and were gone in an instant. Genghis jumped up against the sill, barking and growling furiously. I just sat in bed, still startled from what had happened. After a few minutes, my door swung open to reveal my father and mother. "What the hell is going on in here?" my father shouted. "And why is that window open?" Before I could try to explain, my father grabbed Genghis and dragged him out. "Out with you, goddammit!" he shouted. My mother walked over to the window and noticed the broken lock. "Oh dear, what have you been doing in here with that dirty dog? Your father's going to have a fit when he sees this window." I wanted to tell her about the little creatures, but I knew she would never believe me, and I would probably be scolded for making up stories. When my father came back, Genghis wasn't with him. "From now on, that dog sleeps outside, do you understand? Dogs don't belong in beds with little girls. Furthermore, the dog has something wrong with him. I know a mad dog when I see one, and that dog had hatred in his eyes tonight. One more outburst like that, Megan, and he goes." I wanted to tell them the truth, to tell them about the little creatures and the man who tried to kidnap me, but I was afraid that it would only confirm my father's suspicions that Genghis could be vicious. My father noticed the broken lock when he tried to close the window and told me I would need to sleep in the spare room until it got fixed. As scared as I was that night, I eventually fell asleep, knowing that even though Genghis was outside, he would keep the creatures away. The next night, after my parents were asleep, I brought Genghis into the spare room with me and allowed him to lay in on my bed. With him there, I felt so safe. I only hoped my parents did not wake up during the night and look in on me. Laying in bed with Genghis, I fell right to sleep. I awoke to a loud ruckus. Barking and screeching filled the room. In a panic, I looked around. I noticed the window had been smashed, and Genghis was chasing the two creatures around the room. This time I did scream and shouted for Genghis to get them. They were too fast for him, though, running and jumping everywhere. I saw on Genghis' face a look of rage, and I knew that if he had caught them, he would surely rip them into pieces. Then I felt my mattress stir and felt a sharp pain shoot through my arm. I screamed in pain and turned to see a third creature was biting into my forearm. The others laughed and threw things at Genghis. I grabbed the little beast to pull him away from me, but he bit my hand. I screamed again, and the more I pulled, the more it dug into my skin. Now I could hear my parents at the door banging and yelling for me to open it. The three little creatures then jumped up into the windowsill and were gone. I walked over to the door crying as I opened it. My parents nearly knocked me over as they barged in. I noticed something more than anger in my father's eyes when he saw the mess in the room. He stared at the broken window, then he stared down at me and noticed the blood and bite marks. He then turned to Genghis and walked straight over to him. My father kicked him several times, and Genghis let out a cry of pain. "No! No!" I shouted. "It wasn't his fault!" I ran over to my father, but he pushed me aside, dragging Genghis out. "Please stop him, Mama!" I begged. But my mother just looked at me with anger all over her face. Then her anger turned to concern as she knelt down and began examining the bite marks on my arm and hand. "Oh, why did you let that mangy beast back in the house?" she asked. "He is dangerous, and now he has harmed you." I begged my mother to listen as I told her about the little creatures, but she told me that such lies would only make things worse, and that now I would have to sleep in a cold bedroom. After my mother had bandaged my wounds, my father returned. "Tomorrow," he said, "I'm going to take that dog out in the woods and shoot his head off." "But Papa," I begged. He simply pointed his finger at me and began cleaning up the mess. That night, I did not sleep. The next day when I went to school, I did not see Genghis. It wasn't until later in the day that I found him chained up inside the barn. I knelt down beside him and began to cry. I hugged him and he licked me. "Please," I said, "please, go away. Leave this place or else you would die." He simply whimpered and looked into my eyes. "Please, Genghis, if you love me, you will go. Do it for me." He stared at me, and this time he did not look at me with that confused look a dog gives when trying to understand. For I knew that he did understand, and I knew he would not go. Before my father came home, I took Genghis to Simon Beechcroft's house. He was a kid I knew from school. Also a bit soft in the skull, but not so much as Ralph Towns. I asked if he would keep Genghis in his yard for a bit, and I would pay him with the little money I had. Simon agreed, and I left Genghis with him and rode my bicycle into town. I did so for the next 3 or 4 days until I was eventually able to sell Genghis to a hunter. I told the hunter to go to the Beechcrofts' property, and there he would find Simon and Genghis. I asked him if he would please pay Simon, and I would later come to get the money. I knew I could not be there when he took Genghis away. Later, I retrieved the money from Simon and saw that Genghis was gone. I cried the whole way home and all that night. The next few nights, I checked every window and door before going to sleep. Then I waited for my parents to fall asleep and checked every window and door again, but those nights, nothing happened. One day in late October, however, there was another article in the paper. This time, a family's newborn baby had been snatched right out of her crib at night. The police were still trying to find the missing child, but I knew they would never find her. I knew the Hobyahs had taken her and eaten her, and that all she was now was a pile of bones, if they did not also eat them. I called them the Hobyahs because the sound they made as they were taunting Genghis. "Hobyahs, Hobyahs, Hobyahs!" It will forever haunt my soul. No more murders after that for a while. Lots of livestock found dead and eaten, though. Finally, in early December of that year, the town let out a collective sigh of relief. The police had caught the killer. Or who they thought was the killer. A dirty old man who went by the name of Vern Johnston had been taken to custody for trying to kidnap a young girl on her way to school. Yes, it had been the same filthy man that I had the encounter with over a year ago. I remember the headline in the paper. Murderer caught. I suppose the town simply was in dire need to have an arrest, for they did not hesitate to charge Vern with the savage murders. Although I knew he was innocent of those crimes, I could not feel bad for him. And who would believe me anyway had I told them the real story?
Some more time passed, and now spring had come and the weather was beginning to get warmer. I had not seen or heard from the Hobyahs since last October, but I still checked all the doors and windows every night and slept with a pocket knife in my pajamas.
It was May 3rd. I will never forget. I woke up suddenly startled by a noise. My hands were bound in some kind of twine, and I was being dragged through the hallway. I heard their little giggles and their tiny panting as they dragged me. The Hobyahs! I tried to scream, but again all that was released was the smallest whisper. They had used the strange powder again. I could see many of the creatures running around our house. I could hear, "Hobyahs! Hobyahs! Hobyahs!" echoing all through the house. I began to sob, wishing that Genghis was here. Oh, how I wish I would see him turn the corner. How I wished I would hear his bark. But I didn't. Genghis was gone. But what of my parents? Where were they? Surely they could hear all this commotion. Why had they not come? I was pulled into the kitchen where several of the creatures waited with a large sack. I kicked and struggled, but they simply laughed and slashed at my feet with little knives, all the time giggling and chanting, "Hobyahs! Hobyahs! Hobyahs!" As they got me halfway inside the sack, I bent my head back and could see into my parents' room. How I wished I had never done so. I only saw it briefly, but I saw it nonetheless. My parents in pieces, cut up, torn open and ripped apart. The Hobyahs were eating my parents. Savagely they bit and chewed into their bones, tearing away the flesh. George and Marlene Doyle, my parents who loved me in their own way, had nothing but food for the Hobyahs. Then the sack was pulled over my head and tied shut. I could see no more, but could still hear their heartless little giggles, could still hear the prancing of their little toes, taking me out of my home, taking me away from the world itself. So many thoughts spun through my head as they carried me, wherever they were taking me. My name is Megan Doyle, I thought. I am in the 5th grade and like to read and draw. I have a crush on Simon Beechcroft, even though he is slightly soft in the skull. I have hopes and dreams and love in my heart. I do not deserve to be a pile of bones chewed on and devoured by the Hobyahs. I woke up some time later to find I was still caught in the sack. I struggled as hard as I could to reach my little pocket knife, and at last could feel it in my fingers. Slowly I opened it and began cutting. First the twine on my wrist, then the sack itself. I cut a small hole in the sack and looked out. I did not see anything. I cut it wider, but there was very little light inside. It felt like a damp cave. I cut the hole large enough to poke my head through, but I did not see the Hobyahs. At last I cut a big enough hole to slip my body through and jumped out. I was expecting to hear and see the little creatures spring up and began tackling me back to the ground with their despicable little twine. But nothing. I was in a cave. It was dark, but I could see the light of the opening. I started with a few small steps and then quickly took off into a run. I ran out of the cave and down a steep hill. Tears flowing from my eyes, I ran and did not stop until I thought my lungs were going to crawl out of my throat and beg me for air. I knelt down by a small stream and began to cry even harder. A few hours later I had walked several miles but had no idea where I was. I was so scared. Where was I? Was anyone else here? Were the Hobyahs looking for me? Then I thought I could hear something in the distance. Some familiar sound. Something that filled my heart with hope. Barking. For a moment I felt a great thrill, but it soon died away. It sounded like Genghis, but that was not a possibility. It was some strange dog. Maybe even a vicious dog. Maybe even a dog of the Hobyahs who was leading them straight towards me. At the thought of that, the sound of the barking getting closer now filled me with fear. I turned to run, but tripped over a large root and fell face first to the ground. I turned and looked up, only to see that some animal was now standing over me. I cringed in fear, and then felt a tongue against my face. I opened my eyes and saw him. "Genghis!" I reached up and hugged him as tightly as I could, knowing that now I would never let him go again. The tears were uncontrollable, but Genghis made sure to clean them from my face with his tongue. A moment later, the hunter appeared, running over to me and asking me what had happened. I told the hunter everything, and to my surprise, he believed me. It turned out that he knew of the Hobyahs and had been searching for them for a long time. He asked me if I could remember where they had taken me. It took some time, but we eventually found the cave. At first I was worried, but the hunter told me that there was nothing to be afraid of now. The Hobyahs only ventured out in the open at night. We need to fool them, he said. The creatures are very quick and sneaky, and unless we can surprise them and catch them off guard, they will escape. I told him that the Hobyahs had tied me up in a sack and that when they come back, they would be expecting me to still be there. The hunter scratched his chin and then came up with an idea. Later that night, the Hobyahs did return, 10 of them in all, and they did find the sack still hanging where they had left it. They took it down and used their little knives to cut it open, fully expecting to find a young girl inside. What they found instead was a monstrous dog. Genghis roared and flew out of the sack immediately, crushing one of the small creatures in his jaws. The others frantically ran around the cave trying to escape, but there was nowhere to run, for the hunter had draped a net over the entrance to the cave. Again, Genghis caught one and tore his little body to shreds. He barked and snarled savagely at the creatures who were no longer giggling and singing the little Hobyah, Hobyah, Hobyah song. He bit the head off of the third as the creatures swung desperately at him with their little knives, but it was no use, and eventually Genghis destroyed them all. After that, I was adopted by the hunter and again had Genghis as my dog. He did not live long after that, but he was always there for me and always kept me safe. And so every year around this time, I come back to the small town in West Virginia to visit the spot where my dog, or my friend, is laid to rest. I will never forget him or how he protected my life. I love him still, and always shall.